Hello, everyone, and welcome back to NeuroAlchemy, where science meets soul and where healing is understood as a nonlinear, multidimensional journey. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Young. Here on NeuroAlchemy, we slow conversations down on purpose. We define terms clearly, and we name complexity without overwhelming. And we approach healing as a multidimensional, nonlinear process that honors both the brain and the lived human experience. Today's conversation sits at a powerful intersection: neuroscience, consciousness, and lived human experience. I'm joined by Lincoln Stoller, a psychotherapist and theoretical physicist whose work explores how the brain, body, emotion, intellect, and awareness interact to shape how we think, feel, and live. As always, you're invited to listen gently, pause when you need to. Nothing here is about force or perfection. Feel free to take a breath. You don't need to decide anything today. Lincoln, we're really grateful that you're here.
Thanks.
Before we begin, I always like to start with just a gentle arrival. How are you arriving today, whether that's physically, energetically, however it may be?
Getting over some bronchitis, so I might have a dry cough, but it's getting better. And also today, I'll publish another book on dreams. Book publishing is a long process, and you have to read it a million times. So I think I've finished my millionth reading yesterday, and tonight I'll hit the go button. But the point is that certainly a project like a book, it puts you in a headspace. So of the headspaces you've talked about, I'm currently kind of waist deep in the subconscious one. And although I try to keep a kind of safety line to the science, there's not a great deal of science in the subconscious realm. It's very subjective, obviously, not very repeatable. So I'm trying in that book and in my work right now to, convey that to people, how they get there, what it means, how to look at it kind of out the side of your eye without being overwhelmed by all your usual biases and prejudices and so forth. So dreams are a great avenue into that, as well as hypnosis and to some extent neuropsychology in a very sort of subtle way because it's indirect. And spirituality, sure, meaning, purpose, and then all the front burner things like, you know, what's eating you today and all these things that feed back ultimately tie into, your deeper sense of meaning, subconscious, way your brain habitually works. Anyway, that's where I'm sort of coming from. I feel like I'm juggling balls while I'm waist deep in a swamp of subjectivity. So if I lack some clarity, that's where I'm coming from today.
It's totally acceptable. We always like to say, however you're showing up today is enough. And that is always true for every one of us all of the time. Lincoln, I'd love to start by grounding our listeners just a bit. When you use the word consciousness, what does that mean in everyday language?
Pretty much awareness. It pretty much boils down to awareness. If you're not aware, or what you're aware of limits what you're sort of conscious of. And if you're very aware, you can be very confused. You're aware of social trends and genetic predispositions and educational traumas. If you're aware of all this stuff all at once, it's very hard to complete a sentence with a singular point, which isn't bad. It's just that for communication, communication is a very thin channel. We're basically trying to understand each other using words that often are not agreed on. And I think that's why conversation tends to be rather thin and superficial because it's more easily agreed upon if it's thin and superficial. It gets deep and complicated, people get lost, and at some point they get defensive, evasive, and exhausted. So it's that kind of mix. I forgot your question. But yeah, consciousness. It's a kind of a double-edged sword, right? You can be less conscious and the world is a simpler place, rocks and sticks and staying on the road, or more aware and then you end up dealing with more things, more complexity, more uncertainty, more growth, more learning, more confusion, more another thing that I've been dealing with lately is resentment for all the nonsense that I was taught, which really was wrong. It's like, in my case, I've had a bunch of great mentors, but it seems like in every case of these great mentors, I have to get to the point where I am equal to them before I really accept them. And I understand their mistakes and I understand their prejudices and I kind of forgive them. And those are the better ones, the ones who were open to learning. But most of my teachers have been of lesser quality. They followed textbooks and given the standard erroneous points of view. I mean, like, if you were to read Freud, be very interesting, but you wouldn't take him seriously. He's like 150 years old. Same with almost everybody. The grandfathers or grandmothers of the field, they're all ultimately full of shit, and some of them are laudable and others are just actually, Freud the thing that I like that Freud said the most was that the purpose of psychotherapy is to make a living. All right, pragmatic. I understand. You want to make the money. Well, okay, got to live. All right, I understand. So, yeah, getting over all that. I guess you have to be kind of angry at what you've been taught that was wrong, and you're kind of trying to unload. And it gets back to quantum physics, a whole bunch of nonsense, you know. And the alternative is like confusion. So that's where the creative person exists in a world of confusion. But hopefully, we'll give some clarity.
And when we talk about brainwaves or brainwave frequency, how would you explain those to someone without a neuroscience background?
You can experience them, and you can use the brainwave metaphor as a metaphor pictorially, thinking about waves, classical waves and ocean waves and sound waves, music, and you can develop a sense of correspondence between the kind of waves you're familiar with and the kind of moods you have. And that's pretty good, actually. You don't have to be too electrical and electroencephalographic about it. And those are kind of packed technical concepts, but they boil down to some you know, simple observations, really. So I would say the direct answer is understand your rhythms of life and make a correspondence with the words we use for brain rhythms. I mean, you don't really need to, so you don't need to say alpha and delta and beta and all that stuff. But you do need to understand there's a rhythm to anxiety, there's a rhythm to sleepiness, rhythm to calmness, and maybe there are rhythms to other complicated things like love and trauma and, fill in the blank. Anything that's dominant could be decomposed into a bunch of rhythms. Another good metaphor is music. What music enervates you? What music sedates you? What music do you like? What music have you had enough of? And why? Some of it's experience. I used to love to listen to Telemann flute, whatever they were, concertos or something. When I was 5, I always wanted them to be put on to go to sleep, and now I can't stand listening to them. It's, like, annoying. So that changed. I spent a decade playing classical guitar, and I like that, but I don't have much patience for it anymore. It transmuted into something more, but it's still a question of rhythm and melody and frequency. And anyone can understand that there are frequencies that are calming and others that are make you jump out of your skin. Partly it's frequency in like sound frequency, and other times it's frequency in like calmness and confidence. That's a frequency too. So that's how I would try to get to it. I would start talking about meaningful experiences and how they relate to brain frequencies, and then maybe I'd talk about training brain frequencies, which is a interesting way of approaching your emotions because it doesn't involve emotions. It just involves it's kind of like meditation or mindfulness, becoming aware of your attention absent the issues that you're thinking about. Just, how to be calm, how to be how to fall asleep, how to wake up. So that's to avoid the technicalities of alpha, beta, gamma, and delta for most people. But there are some do-it-yourself devices, brain headsets, neurofeedback, that you can actually see those brain frequencies and start to make them useful as tools. But usually that's a kind of pretty big stretch. At the end of this conversation, my offer is to sell at a discount of $5 my mini course, which is a pre-recorded series of videos on brain frequencies, in which I try to explain this at greater length. So, there is a way into it. That's how I answer your question.
So, I'm going to just reflect something here for our listeners. Your brain is always producing these, it always has electrical activity. These patterns show up as different frequencies, which are often referred to as brain waves. Those slower waves tend to support rest and integration, and faster waves support alertness and focus. Neurofeedback works by showing the brain what it's doing in real time and allowing it to learn through the feedback how to shift toward greater balance. It doesn't force the brain, but it invites it to learn. Lincoln, how do you explain neurofeedback to clients who feel intimidated or unsure?
Well, I would try to get them to experience it. And there are different ways to do that. If they're local, I can bring them into my office. I can show them their brain waves and I can put them into sleepy states and ruminating states and various hypnotic states and show them their brain waves and say, look, this is what you can see and this is what you felt. But beyond what you said, it doesn't actually work out all that clearly that you can map them because well, a simple example is if you change your brainwave state, you know, every 30 seconds, it will appear as if there's a very slow brainwave going on, one that cycles every 30 seconds, which is how you're changing. But that's a figment of you're changing neurology. So there's a certain assumption of constancy, which is false. So the brain wave, which is an extracted concept from a very noisy signal, sometimes works if it's constant. But if it's changing, if your brain is changing, you get these incorrect reflections of things. So you can be changing your state from calm to anxious, and it will show a slow brainwave component, which someone might say is calmness and sleepy, but it's not. So, it quickly gets confusing. So I try to avoid that. I can avoid that by showing people. Well, I'm not sure I avoid it, but, I show them what's really going on. But I like to work remotely because I don't like to be limited to who can reach my office, which is a very tiny section of who can reach me worldwide. So that means using these headsets. And although the Muse headset, MUSE, is not the best, it's the cheapest. Well, maybe not the cheapest, but the cheapest that I trust. And it's a do-it-yourself thing. You put it on, you buy it for a couple $100, and it doesn't tell you exactly what's going on, but it gives you some feedback, and it gives you a way to start appreciating control. It's more like meditation. In fact, that's what they sell it as, partly because they want to legally protect themselves, and partly because it's a simpler selling point. So the high level is you come in and you see actual brain waves and they stick little contacts in your head. And the low level is you buy a do-it-yourself home unit and go into it from the meditation point of view. In either way, you get some experience of what the feedback means, and the results are quite different. I don't quite understand why they're so different, but I can have a huge effect when I bring people into my office and work with them, much more dramatic than when they do the do-it-yourself home approach. But, if you're 5,000 miles away, then the home approach is something worth exploring. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
One thing that stood out in your intake is your emphasis on structure over insight alone. Many listeners have done years of therapy, reflection, or even meditation, but they might still feel stuck in those familiar patterns. Can you speak a little bit to why insight isn't always enough and how working directly with the brain can support more sustainable change?
Well, I think there are a couple of answers to that, maybe a lot of answers to that. But the most prominent one that strikes me is that we're very habitual creatures. And that's important. You develop habits so you don't have to think about them. You learn how to walk so you don't have to think about walking. You learn how to talk so you don't have to think about talking. To some extent, you learn how to think so you don't have to think about thinking. And you develop all these habits. And some of them are cognitive and some of them are emotional. Some of them are neurological or metabolic. And they can be stuck points. Your heart rate variability, breathing, pulse coordination could be off. And how would you know? Because it's become a habit. So then you can get some feedback and it can show you and you can see how to change it. It's as if you learn to walk poorly, as if you learn to walk with shoes of different heights in their sole and you compensated by, waggling your hips and leaning over. And now you think that's normal. And it may have become normal, but it may have, generated hip problems and back problems and muscle problems and then headache problems. And the last you think is it's because of your shoes. But, take your shoes off and learn to walk straight, and a lot of things will change. So I'm trying to what was the question again? I almost have it.
We're just talking about why insight isn't always enough,
Okay.
and working directly with the brain often supports more sustainable change. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about awareness and consciousness.
Well, I also wanted to get to the point of trauma and prejudice. Prejudice being how you look at things, how you filter your awareness. So if you have a prejudice to how you look at things, maybe, and there's cultural stuff too, like xenophobia and racism and homophobia and gender prejudice, which we don't even see anymore. It's like built in our neighborhood and our culture and our family. And I remember I was living in the Caribbean and I was living in a fishing village, Afro Caribbean bunch of people. And then I was sitting around I was a teenager, sitting around with my friends on the stoop in the afternoon. And this big, jet black woman, one of these sort of West African matrons, came by with a, basket of fruit on her head. And she said, "Oh, Percy, I see you have a nice white friend." And it was so beautiful because it didn't mean what it would have meant in a sort of urban American city. It was like, "Oh, yes, she's a really nice white friend." And she was so sort of heartfelt and sincere about it. And she just walked on. That it just reminded me that there's so much packed into language that we assume. And then when somebody doesn't use the language right, they make a comment that seems off color, then you're not quite sure how to take things and whether your alliances are right or whether your presentations are correct and whether your hat is on straight so that your knowledge of what's going on and your awareness can become confused. And if you could watch your brain waves, you'd probably see them start to fritz out here and there with sort of blasts of high frequency anxiety coming in. Another thing I've done, I should mention sort of parenthetically, I don't do it anymore. Wasn't very moral. It was very scientific. Is I would, you can give people feedback to their brainwaves and simple feedback that coaxes their brainwaves in one direction or another. Something simple like a thermometer on the computer screen that reads higher when their brain waves are more agitated and reads lower when their brain waves are more calm. And you say to them, make the thermometer go down, make the music get calm. And I used to manipulate people. These were my friends, not my clients, by making their brainwaves get more and more anxious because they would say, I don't know what my brainwaves are doing. And I'd say, well, try this. And I would encourage their brains to get more and more high frequency. And it was very scientific. They would get more and more anxious and more upset. And then when they finally get angry, and then they would yell at me. And I would say, see, I didn't tell you to do anything. I didn't say anything nasty. I just encouraged your brain to become dysregulated. And this is how it felt. And I sort of did that with my friends until I found that it was actually kind of destructive. And it wasn't always so easy to get back to a normal state after I'd discombobulated them. But it was very interesting to do, to know how some people are sensitive and other people are not. It'd be like, well, you mentioned heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is an attempt to coordinate your cardiopulmonary system to be more sympathetic and collaborative, has some biochemical basis. And it would be very immoral to try to dysregulate someone. You give them a heart attack or something. It'd be very scientific, one of those awful science experiments. Be very interesting. Maybe some people would like to do it with rabbits, but I don't really subscribe to doing it with anything. I don't know how far you want to go with the science stuff, because medicine is not science. Clinical medicine is all about helping people. Science is all about taking things apart, people included. So that's my answer.
What changes when we include the nervous system and brain in the healing process?
Everything to some degree. But then that would kind of be an empty answer because it would apply to everything. Well, that's what happens when you include the lymphatic system. It's what happens when you include the digestive system, cardiopulmonary system. These are all connected systems. Adding them in changes the mix. Ultimately, they should all be in balance, which is sort of like a concerto where all the instruments are coordinating. And maybe you can think of the brain as the conductor, although that's maybe kind of sketchy. But not everybody coordinates in the same way. So some people have trauma, and that trauma leaves a residual in terms of what they're willing to admit, engage, consider. And you can say, well, that's part of the balancing process too. They may not be ready to unlock the tensions in their bodies originate in some past trauma. And that's got to be okay. You got to work with that. So, as a clinical counselor, I try to get a big picture on people's health. How much is it psychological? How much is it relational, historical, genetic, intentional, unconscious, to get a sense of the geography of their awareness. What are they avoiding and why? And you get some people that are very effective and very courageous and energetic, and you feel you understand them and they understand you, and you move forward quickly and you make progress and you feel great. And, everybody's egos is improved, but so is their lives and considered a good result. And then you get other people who are anywhere in the sort of dysfunctional spectrum, from mentally ill to traumatized or violent or something. And those people are difficult, and you feel you're not so successful and you're not collaborating. But the truth is that if that's part of the process, if I piss some client off and they leave telling me that I'm unprofessional or incompetent, maybe that's what I needed to do. I needed to show them that was the option and they needed to decide to go there or not. It's not up to me to fix anybody. So ultimately, I tend to be an educator. I talk to them about what your brain waves do, and maybe they can get a handle on that. Talk to them about their diet, and talk to them about all these things that you're aware of. And some of them resonate. It's like they say, you sort of throw it on the wall and see what sticks. And some things don't. They'll take some suggestions and not others. And then when they leave, happily or otherwise, you kind of have to say, well, I did my best and my job is done.
Mhm.
And off they go in whatever direction they choose, hopefully somewhat informed by my information. So we're trying to make ourselves obsolete, deliver all we have to offer, and then leave the picture.
I could not agree more. I feel that way in my soul. Like, I feel like if I'm doing what I aim to do as well as I aim to do it, then the people that come to work with me won't need me after that because I'll have taught them so well how to care for themselves, right? That they won't need to come back to me, and I feel personally that that's what makes me feel like I'm doing something right. Here's what I love too is that, neurofeedback and brain training are deeply scientific, and when done well, they're also profoundly human. They invite humility, curiosity, and they invite the nervous system into the conversation. Lincoln, how do you see this work supporting not just symptom re education, but deeper agency, awareness, and wholeness?
Well, that's kind of a big jump. How do I see it? Well, it's a question of becoming more aware, becoming aware of more, and becoming more aware of what you are aware of. I remember one client who had a history of heart problems, and I showed them the heart rate variability feedback, and the result was all over the map. They were not coordinated, and it made scientific sense that that was part of their problem. And it turns out heart rate variability, for most people, is very easy to learn because it involves some conscious things like breath and pulse, which you have some control over. And I don't actually remember whether this person balanced their heart rate variability in the short period we had, but it was clear that they could if they worked at it. So the technical side, which is only useful if it gives you some tool, could help them be more balanced, insightful, calm. And when you gain insight and depth and balance, you also gain the ability to go deeper into more dysregulation, either in you or around you or the people in your family. And although we say you can't change other people, you do change other people if you change yourself because you sort of draw them forward or draw things out of them. If you have a hostile relationship with your parents and you become very calm and accepting, they'll tend to follow you, hopefully, in being more accepting and aware of themselves. And then changes happen slowly, not always. This is sort of the definition of mental illness. You are sane when you have some ability to calibrate yourself. You are not sane when nothing can be done to help you. And I'm talking about mentally, but physically is not all that different either. So, actually, I was listening to a podcast, a webinar on traditional Chinese medicine, and the practitioners were saying, food is the first thing you look at. What you eat is your medicine. And if you're not eating right, it can upset the whole system. Traditional Chinese medicine has a whole system of ranking and rating foods on their, you know, qi and whatnot. And, that's like another technology, which I think can be an obstacle if it's doesn't feel natural to you. So, but become aware. So you may not be particularly aware of your diet because you're concerned with your relationship. And once you deal with your relationship, you can become more aware of your diet. And it can change your life somewhat subtly. Drink more water can be a wise thing to say, or it can be a stupid thing to say, depending on what's the nature of your imbalance. So I would try to go to experience. I mean, I do educate people and I do try to develop some insight into quantitative measures, but science is not all it's cracked up to be. It's rather narrowly defined and often doesn't hit the spots that people need. So, I mean, I'm involved with quantum physics, which is a source of infinite frustration because you get lots of people who tell you what's going on and don't know. And ultimately, in all science, nobody knows. It's just today's theory. And often they don't want you to know, those who teach it, they don't want you to know where it fails, then it all falls apart. So you can take these things like brainwaves, and I think mostly they're useful as metaphors, unless you're a researcher and you know how contrived the whole thing is. For example, there is an approach to brainwaves that says certain brainwaves correspond to certain states of mind and body, and by training and balancing them, you can balance the states of minds and body. And there's another approach that says by mixing everything up and confusing everything, you kind of break the habits and the system will then reestablish its balance so that the brainwave training is actually dysregulatory. And seriously, I mean, you listen to cacophonous brainwave entrainment and then you relax and hopefully your system recalibrates itself naturally. So there are different approaches and there's different scientific explanations for each. And some of them stand up and some of them are just horseshit. And it can be funny, you say, that doesn't make any sense. That's not even consistent. But you'll get a whole bunch of people who believe it and write papers about it and overlook the shortcomings. And okay, that's science, it's like it's creative nonsense.
Where do you
Sometimes it
see
works.
neuroscience and consciousness meeting in your clinical practice?
Well, I don't see them meeting very closely. Like I say, it's mostly a metaphor. I work with a person to understand how they're feeling. And if they like the brainwave metaphor, that's good. But I don't want to get them all, you know, confused by it. Because, the brainwaves, they don't exist. They're extracted as components from a noisy signal. And then it's sort of assumed that, oh, those components are being generated by certain cells in certain parts of your brain. But there's no there's no good evidence for that because if you look at the small voxels in the brain, they continue to make noisy signals. So to some extent, you can see, oh, well, certain people with certain abilities have certain brain signatures. This was sweet. Most people who are neurologically informed are aware that the left side of your brain manages the right side of your body and the right side, the left, so that the left eye um, more orients to the events on the right side of your visual field and vice versa. And I always thought that was like true. It turns out to be false. It turns out that the foveal view, the narrow central view, is coordinated or is symmetric, and the peripheral view is antisymmetric or the other way around. So again, it's kind of humorous. You take these theories and you use them, and they work sort of, and they have certain errors, which you overlook or try to refine. But if you're going to use them therapeutically, you've got to build a story that has some personal experience. So a person needs to be able to understand and feel slow frequencies that make them feel calm. How high frequencies, or whatever feels like high frequencies, makes them anxious. And then to some extent, they want to control them. But there's a place for being anxious and a place for being calm. But you don't want to be calm when you're driving. You don't want to be too calm because you got to be aware of quick responses and unexpected events. You don't want to fall asleep while you're driving, and you don't want to be too anxious or reactive when listening to another person describe their inner feelings, because it's not your role to be reactive in those cases. So you're trying to give people a skill, like learning to ride a bicycle. You don't tell them where to go. You don't tell them what to do with it. You just try to improve their awareness and apply it to their situation. So if you're a scientific person, maybe the idea of waves is natural to you. If you're an artistic person, maybe the idea of harmony and synchrony and balance is more natural to you. And then, of course, there's what's the nature of your problem? What's the nature of your imbalance? Are you personally imbalanced? Are you relationally imbalanced? Are you familially imbalanced with your parents and siblings or children? All of these give different colors to the use you might use of brainwaves, or maybe none. Maybe you just like, okay, that was useful. Now let's solve your problem. Or maybe there was no problem. You were just overly anxious and concerned, like many of us are concerned about money, future, mortality, and health in areas that we'd be better off if we stopped worrying about it and did what felt natural and was rewarded by the environment we built. So, I have to go back and forth. It could be technical or non-technical.
How do brain waves relate to identity? What happens when someone realizes their symptoms or their behaviors aren't character flaws, but learned neural strategies?
Well, I think once that's done, the work is over. Once you've learned that your behaviors are habitual and you've learned what that means, then you can change them, or at least you can work at changing them. You can go off and say, oh, if I'm imbalanced and that's the source of my stress, now I know I have a sense of what balance means, then I can work at balance. And it can be physical balance, it can be emotional balance, it can be circadian balance. What's the nature of your imbalance? You might say that an imbalanced person, if there's such a thing in general, would have imbalances everywhere. It's hard to be judgmental. So, for example, I normally stay up till 4 in the morning, and then I get up around 10. So that's like 6 hours of sleep, but I usually sleep an hour or 2 in the afternoon. So I tend to get my sleep 7 hours, but it's broken. Is that imbalanced? I don't know. The result is I dream a lot more and remember a lot more dreams, and I consider dreams an important doorway to my emotions. So although my schedule may look odd, it may be what I need. And because I work from home and like to work over Zoom, I can schedule my life around this. So it's hard to be judgmental about what's balanced and normal. We like to use certain metrics that we trust, like heart rate variability and, pulse, breath balance. And maybe you can be a traditional Chinese doctor and use other aspects of the pulse, which can be scientific or sort of semi-scientific, or you might say pseudoscientific. I'm not sure. I don't know that much. And but if they help people gain control and find balance, and how do you know that? Usually, as counselors, we know it because they stop coming to us, and we get some sense of their positive trajectory. I mean, they've you know their trajectory has moved them far enough into the positive that they are not gonna spend $200 talking to me every 2 weeks. I mean, they still get a benefit from it, but maybe not enough. They use their resources some other way. And they're off and running in a balanced way until they hit the next bump, which hopefully is more deeply spiritual and more socially impactful. This is what I tell people. You may have solved today's problem, but there are plenty of bigger problems in the world, and I hope you confront them because they need to be solved. And then I don't know what you do. come back to me, use the tools we've discussed.
What gives people hope when change feels slow?
I think change gives people hope when change is slow. So you want to connect to some sense of positive movement, some sense of relief, but relief is dicey because you know, it can be a palliative, it can be an anesthetic, it can be a coping strategy, all of which perpetuates bad habits. And you might have to choose maybe diet over smoking or one bad habit over another bad habit. If you're a schizophrenic, maybe smoking is not a bad thing because it may keep you balanced and keep you from flipping out. It may shorten your life, but you may have a better life. So for some people, the whole notion of balance has to be recalibrated.
I
And
think everybody's
ultimately,
calibration's different too.
that's right. It's different. Nobody's like normal, and everybody's slightly on a spectrum of one kind or another. And there's no perfect balance. This is sort of,
It's
if
like
you were,
it's an ing, it should be a verb. It's ongoing. The balance action is well, at least I think, I don't know about you, but from the moment you're born until the moment you die, you're in a continuing state of balancing all the time on all the levels.
well, see, this is interesting. It's not true for all animals. Well, maybe it is because I really only know humans. But the people like to have relationships with dogs, they tend to be stable in different ways if they're well brought up and have their act together. And they can stabilize people. Their lives seem to be much more simple
Mm,
and they can provide a lot of balance to a person to
mm.
have an intimate relationship with an animal. So with a dog doesn't work so much with a lizard. But some people works with a bird. I've heard stories of people growing up with monkeys, very complicated, a little more like people. So it depends who you are. I don't know. The monkey stories are just too far out. That's too difficult. A monkey is like a person. So if you have trouble with people, you probably have trouble with monkeys. Where I live in Victoria, British Columbia, dogs are popular. It's almost like those Philip Pullman stories, the Golden Compass, where everybody has a daemon. They all have dogs. And when I meet these people on the trail, their dogs are so much more interesting than the people. The dogs are inquisitive. The dogs want to know you. The people are like standoffish and avoid your
Yeah.
eyes. Think, what a waste. Get rid of these people. If the world be run by dogs, might be a better place. But this is the point. This is what people are. People are unstable configurations. It's what gives us power and also is our weakness, makes us do terrible things. Us meaning, so the royal we. And here you've got individuals trying to balance their lives, trying to find a container of what they're responsible for and what they can affect. And they're successful or not to varying degrees. I used to be very anti-religious. I'm still pretty anti-religious. But, I see that religion is a community effort and it creates a container and defines people's relationships to each other and themselves, provides some guardrails and some definitions and resources. And without that, you get these sort of like typical white upper class neighborhoods where every house is independent and everyone has a fence that keeps them apart and no one talks to each other. So, yeah, it gets very intellectual. And as my experience with academics has taught me, that's not particularly healthy.
We always end our conversations with a micro practice invitation, not a big protocol or perfection, just a small embodied practice that our listeners can explore each day over the next week. Lincoln, what gentle micro practice would you offer to help people begin noticing their own brain, body, or awareness patterns differently?
Well, I have that online course whose price I lowered to $5, and that will be available through the end of March, and you'll hopefully put a link to that product. It's a series of webinars, basically. on brainwaves in an attempt to connect you to the different feelings of these brainwaves and how you can isolate, refine, and balance them. So that's a kind of attempt to step between the science and the experience. And another approach, I would say there's kind of three approaches. There's the neurological approach, and then there's the kind of cognitive approach, what's reasonable, rational, intentional, conscious, and aware, and verbal. That's kind of the talk therapy approach. And the third approach is the subconscious approach, which I've been working through dreams, but also through hypnosis, so through guided visualization. So I would say something people should do to balance is remember their dreams. And people say, "Oh, I don't remember my dreams," or "I can't remember my dreams." And it's very simple remembering your dreams. All you have to do is want to. And then presto, magic, you start remembering them. It's a coordinated thing. It's as if your dreams don't really want you to remember them because you're just kind of a bull in the china shop and you make a mess of the whole thing.
I'll tell you, Lincoln, when I was younger, I was very intentional. I wanted to remember my dreams. And so I read some books from my spiritual teacher, and he had some techniques that I started with. So I would tell myself every night, like, I want to remember my dreams tonight. And then when I got up in the morning, at first I was writing them down with paper and pen. And even if it was only one word,
Yeah.
brown. Like, that was totally okay, but
Yeah.
I did it day after day after day after day, and by the time I stopped doing that, Lincoln, it was because at that point, I was using a voice recorder, and I was recording them in the voice recorder, and I got so good at recording my dreams that I would wake up in the middle of the night, hit record, and just talk right from the dream and have no memory at all of having woken up and been doing that dream recording. So I got to be a little too enthusiastic,
Yes.
but for all those people that are saying, I can't remember my dreams, start with where you are.
Well, the purpose of dreams, so the next step is once you've remembered a little bit of your dreams, and you're right, all you need is like a word because without the word, there's no connection between the dream reality and yours. But with a word, all of a sudden, and the purpose of dreams, I would like to say, and this is the nature of my book, which I guess will be available by the end of today. And this is what's really important, and this is what people don't understand. Most of our lives are spent making sense of things. Dreams, the purpose of dreams is to explore the nonsense of things, is to explore the things that don't fit and the ideas that don't work and the conflicts that arise in a safe environment that's not real but feels real, so that you can experience the other side of life, the side that doesn't work, the mistakes that you can't make in real life, the offenses you don't want to commit. Like what would it feel like to drive down the road and intentionally steer yourself into an oncoming semi truck? You'll never do that in real life. But in a dream, you could, and it would feel real. And you would learn some dramatic things about sadness and regret and foolishness and wisdom. You can't learn them in real life because, well, I also do extreme sports where you actually do sort of put your life on the line. And that's kind of a halfway experience of being a fool and learning a lesson. But the point of dreams is to experience these things viscerally. And you're not coming to a conclusion, you're coming to an experience. So that's the point of doing it, to have the experience of a larger sense of life, which you couldn't safely do in waking life. And when you take that approach and you're less judgmental and more accepting, then you can see this was just an aspect of ugliness which I need to understand better. And now I do, and I can let it go. And maybe I can see other people as still struggling with that problem and be more. So it opens your awareness. Awareness was like the first thing we talked about. So it opens your awareness. It's not scientific. It's not objective. It's not particularly repeatable. But like you say, you can kind of go overboard with it and, you know, or you can use it. You can become an artist, write fiction and paint abstract paintings and be inspired
I
or
also
do
used it to do, like,
podcasts.
the gestalt. I would take the data that I got from my voice recordings, and then I would pull out the symbology, and then I would gestalt with the symbology of the dream to, like, navigate whatever was going on in my life. Very wild, a lot of fun, but
Yeah,
very
right.
time consuming if
Very
you put
time
a lot
consuming.
into it,
That's
yeah.
right.
As we begin to close, I'd love to ask you one more question. What do you most hope listeners remember about themselves after today's conversation?
To be tolerant, to be patient, and to make an effort. Like you got involved with the dreams and maybe you got over involved, but you took it and you milked it and now you have it as a skill you can go back to if you want to. And the interesting thing is that you gain more by trying less. You open yourself to more opportunities by being less judgmental often. And then you can be, it's like the expression of letting go to get a better grip. You can become more judgmental after you have more awareness of the things that can be judged. So becoming less judgmental and less intolerant, doubling my negatives, can be confusing, but it can also be enlightening. So that's what I think people should come away with: a greater tolerance, a greater relaxation, a greater sense of rhythm. Look at your whole daily, digestive, cognitive, physical rhythms. And as you walk down the street the next time you go shopping, wonder how it all fits together. And if you were less controlling, maybe you'd see things that you didn't notice out of the corners of your eyes or the quick ideas that flip through your mind. So you can be more attentive by being less attentive, by being more open to the things that you normally overlook. You could take that too far and become scatterbrained, but it's good to be flexible. So that's what I would say. Be flexible and get help. Read my books, listen to these podcasts. Don't go overboard.
And to all of you out there, Lincoln will be sending me his links for how to get in touch with him. And probably his book will be in there. And the course he mentioned, he's going to be sending all of that over to me so you can find that in the show notes. Lincoln, thank you for this thoughtful, grounded conversation. To our listeners, thank you for being here. If something in today's conversation resonated with you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to this episode. That's how these conversations travel, and that's how they reach the people who need to hear them the most. And I want to leave you with this: you're not broken, your brain is adaptable. Your nervous system can learn safety. And healing isn't about overriding who you are, it's about working with your system. Thank you for joining us on NeuroAlchemy. You are not broken, you're becoming. Bye for now.
Thanks, Sarah.